Hi there, it's Llarold, and this is our updated BFA Protection Warrior preview. Prot Warriors were one of the first classes we covered, and at the time they were one of the most changed classes from Legion. Blizzard's continued changing them a lot since then, so let's cover what's new. Back in the last video, Blizzard had removed Ignore Pain without putting any defensive rage spender in its place. I complained a lot about that in that video, and 2 days later, Blizzard returned Ignore Pain to Protection Warriors. Hooray! Unfortunately, it's now on the global cooldown, which is a real bummer. Although it has been nerfed from Legion, the tuning on it still feels pretty decent. It's not as strong, and now that it has a fixed rage cost, it does require more skillful rage management. But it works better in the overall scheme of how the class handles in BFA. Warriors have way more passive damage reduction than they did in Legion, so Ignore Pain is less of a crutch the class has to lean on to stay alive, and more of a useful secondary defensive tool. The GCD change is a real bummer though, really. I've tried to be positive about it, and this is me doing my best. I hate it. In the best case scenario, you can try your best to only use Ignore Pain in place of Devastate or Revenge, but ultimately casting it requires you to put your rotation on hold. Hold on, mobs! I can't generate Rage or reset Shield Slam right now because I'm ignoring your pain. The best silver lining I can come up with is that if Blizzard reverts these GCD shenanigans, Prot Warrior would be awesome. Yeah. On the subject of really good passive damage reduction, the Prot Warrior passive has been renamed from Defensive Stance to Vanguard, and it's been buffed a couple of times. It now grants you 35% extra stamina, up from 30%, and gives you armor equal to 45% of your strength, up from 40%. Those are a couple of great buffs that have helped put Prot Warrior on a lot more equal footing with the other classes. Here's another good change. Shield Block's rage cost has been reduced to 30 rage, down from 40. Finally, the last big change to Warrior is a change to the entire game. When we previously covered Warrior, block had been redesigned, and it's been redesigned again. Now, when you block an attack, its damage is reduced just like armor. Basically, if you have 50% damage reduction from block, the attack will be reduced by 50%. After that, it's reduced a second time by your armor. This is a little change from how it worked in Legion and before Legion, where block was a flat 30% damage reduction before any passive traits. It's a humongous change from earlier in the BFA beta where your block value would just get added directly to your armor value. In that case, block usually would turn into like 15 to 20% damage reduction. Pretty sizable nerf from Legion. This version is a massive improvement over both of those once you're able to get over 30% block value, which should be pretty doable in the first raid tier. Probably. Right now in testing on characters that have Mythic and Taurus level gear, the damage reduction from block is around 47 or 48%, which is a substantial step up from the flat 30% of Legion and before. One more special note, just for Protection Warriors, critical block doesn't double the block value, it doubles the block damage reduction percentage. Basically it works in the easiest way to understand. If you have 40% damage reduction from block, a critical block reduces that hit by 80%. This is really good, but it does have a cap at 85% damage reduction. This is Blizzard's way of making sure that you can't critically block a hit all the way down to 0 damage, and it's really not a huge problem. It will create a soft cap on block value over 42.5% damage reduction, but normal block damage reduction will still be valuable, and Mastery should still be a good defensive stat. Alright, that pretty much covers all of the base class changes, so now let's look at talents. There have been a few important changes to talents that affect the balance of the entire tree, so let's just dive right in. The first tier of talents starts off with the revamped Into the Fray. This talent still scales with enemies and allies, meaning it's going to be worth 15% haste in most group situations, and it's not an additive 15% haste, it's a multiplicative 15% haste, which means it's even better. It's really nice for AoE tanking, and it'll definitely be the best option in the tier for dungeons, ad fights, and world content. Punish has been nerfed a good bit from earlier in the beta. It's still a solid talent for single target tanking and DPS, but it just can't quite compete with Into the Fray. Impending Victory was buffed up to a 20% heal, but it's still irrelevant. Nothing in the next tier has changed. Thunderclap is AoE pickup radius, Bounding Stride's great mobility, and Safeguard is a decent off-tank external. The third tier got a new talent, Dragon Roar. It was really underwhelming at first, but it has been buffed up in terms of damage, and it's pretty decent now. Unfortunately, it's next to Unstoppable Force, which is amazing, so you're probably never going to take Dragon Roar unless you desperately need a slow. Best Serve Cold is not great. Indomitable is a constant 10% health increase, which isn't bad. Never Surrender has been redesigned a whole bunch of times, but now it's back to being basically the same as it was in Legion, except Ignore Pain is way less powerful in BFA, so this talent went from bad to worse. Ugh. Last in the tier is Bolster, which greatly reduces the cooldown of Last Stand and supercharges it from a good defensive cooldown into an insane defensive cooldown. Bolster not only gives you guaranteed blocks the entire time Last Stand is active, it lets you regenerate at least a full shield block charge during those 15 seconds too. This talent is really good, and it synergizes nicely with Anger Management down in the last tier. The next tier of talents is unchanged from earlier in the beta. It's still good. Booming Voice is nerfed from Legion, granting only 40 rage and 15% damage increase, and now that Demoralizing Shout is on the GCD, it's not nearly as fun to hit as it was before. Despite all of those negatives, it's still the most reliable overall talent in the tree. It also synergizes well with Anger Management in the next tier, which seems like it will still be the go-to talent. On top of all of that, Demoralizing Shout getting its cooldown cut all the way down to 45 seconds is still a pretty huge buff to the value of this talent, even with all the nerfs. Vengeance has been redesigned to work basically just like it does in Legion, and it provides the most damage reduction of the 3 talents in this tier by far. It makes Revenge worth casting before Ignore Pain even if it's not free, just like it has in Legion. Ignore Pain being on the GCD makes using this talent harder and less rewarding, and I'm really not a fan of how it plays now. Even if it is the better talent mathematically, which it is, it's just not fun to play and I don't really like it. Speaking of not very fun to play and I don't really like it, Devastator totally sucks now. It can still potentially be worth using in AoE situations where you're getting enough rage and free revenge procs where you wouldn't have opportunities to cast Devastate at all, but its damage and Shield Slam proc chance have been demolished from Legion, and it no longer generates rage at all. I'm sorry to be the bearer of horrible news, but we're gonna have to go back to hitting Devastate manually. Yikes. Finally, the last tier is all the exact same as it is in Legion. The redesign of Rage Generation was a pretty big nerf to Anger Management, but the death of Devastator was a pretty big nerf to Shield Slam usage rate that would have helped Heavy Repercussions. So with Anger Management getting indirectly nerfed and Heavy Repercussions getting indirectly nerfed, it all kind of cancels out. Anger Management is still the best talent in BFA at this point. Ravager is the one talent in the tree that didn't get nerfed, but it's so bad that it doesn't matter. It's the talent that won't die. Blizzard's just decided to put it in the corner and ignore it forever, I guess. Here is the talent setup I would run for almost everything. The one talent I would change around is Punish up in tier 1. For single target encounters where you can't get enough allies standing in range of you to hit 5 stacks, Punish is the best. It's also really good for just generally reducing your spell damage taken if you're up against an enemy who does a lot of spell damage for some reason. Otherwise, it's going to be into the fray all the way. Before we finish up, I want to go over Azerite traits. Prot Warriors only had 3 when we last looked at them, and one of those has been completely redesigned. One thing to bear in mind with Azerite traits is that you can potentially get 3 ranks of any trait depending on your gear. So a trait that's kind of interesting at 1 rank could be really good at 3 ranks. Up first is Bloodsport, which increases the absorbed value of Ignore Pain and grants you a small amount of leech for 8 seconds. I'm not really sold on this. Maintaining the leech buff should be pretty easy, but the bonus just isn't that interesting. If it's tuned well enough, it could be the best trait by far, but it doesn't seem like it will. Brace for Impact is up next, and it makes casting Shield Slam increase your block value and Shield Slam's damage. This buff works like a Druid's Iron Fur, where if you're able to chain cast Shield Slam, it stacks up repeatedly without extending the duration. Unfortunately, with Devastator out of the picture, the chances of actually getting to stack this buff up multiple times are pretty slim. It's a cool buff on paper, but basically, you're just gonna have 1 or 2 stacks up most of the time. Callous Reprisal makes Revenge deal a little extra damage and reduce your target's damage dealt to you by 5%. I'm sorry, 0.5%, stacking up to 3 times. Basically, it's 1.5% damage reduction if you can maintain it. 1.5% damage reduction is like just enough that it's good, but not exciting either. This could be pretty good in AoE, maybe. If you had 3 ranks in it, it would be 4.5% damage reduction. That's okay, but it's a little bit of a challenge to try and maintain. Hitting Revenge every 8 seconds or less isn't impossible, especially in AoE tanking, but it's not great. Deafening Crash has been redesigned, and it now increases Thunderclap's damage and makes it extend the duration of Demoralizing Shout on enemies by 1 second. On its own, it's not amazing, but if you have this trait on 2 or 3 pieces of Azerite gear, it could get pretty interesting. Combine that with Avatar and Unstoppable Force, and you've got the potential to keep Demo Shout up for a long time. Add on Booming Voice and Anger Management, and this is a very solid trait. Iron Fortress is another new trait, and it's interestingly boring, like a really good hot dog. It's good, it's great. It's still just a hot dog. It increases your block value and makes blocking attacks deal damage. It makes crit blocks deal double damage too. This trait could be really good, especially in AoE. Reinforced Plating grants you a stacking strength buff when you block attacks. It has a bit of positive synergy with Iron Fortress, and it will increase your damage and damage reduction. It's cool. Last up is Sword and Board, which grants you a strength buff whenever Devastate or Devastator resets the cooldown of Shield Slam. Much like Reinforced Plating, it has good offensive and defensive value due to the strength to armor conversion. It's another decent trait. So now for the 2 most important questions. Is Protection Warrior still fun, and is it good? Prot Warrior is definitely looking a lot better on the beta right now than when we covered it a few months ago. The class has really strong passive mitigation, and a better defensive cooldown toolkit than ever. Shield block is also the strongest it's ever been. Unfortunately, Ignore Pain being on the global cooldown is a real fly in the ointment. It's a wrench in the gears. A poop in the soup. It's a bummer because the rest of the class is working well and feels really cohesive. If Ignore Pain does get taken off the GCD, then hooray, I'll throw a party. If not, I guess we'll just have to get used to weaving it in place of Devastate or Revenge casts. Blah. Well, I think that about covers it. If you have any questions about Prot Warrior, ask away. The BFA pre-patch is coming in the next couple of weeks, so stay tuned for some pre-patch content, and as always, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Bye.